I'll say welcome and good afternoon to everyone. Good afternoon to all our participants who have logged on, who've signed on, who've conveyed an interest and need for this topic. We thank you for your interest. And I want to say thank you, and I can't say thank you enough or sufficiently to our partners, the Department of Education and USDLA, for making this teleconference possible, for sharing with us at the MBI, the Minority Broadband Initiative, the importance of this topic and the importance of providing you, those in the trenches and out there in the field, with a platform for a discussion of these regulations. So a special thank you to our subject matter experts who are giving their time generously in support of your success in navigating the details of these distance learning regulations. So the MBI and all participants joining today are committed to supporting HBCUs and TCUs meet the terms and conditions of the Department of Education's regulations in advance of any deadlines. Now, many of you are old-time participants in MBI teleconferences, and you know the purpose for which we were launched in 2019 to leverage networks and locations of HBCUs and TCUs, and that the MBI works with those schools to promote them as hubs of digital applications and innovations, and we hope in the long run force multipliers in our society. As a result of the pandemic, the MBI has had to expand its objectives to include fostering a discussion that will result in finding a strategic path toward increasing the chances of HBCUs to move from the immediate response of COVID-19 to a long-term, sustainable, and shared future. To also foster discussion for proactive collaboration to respond to distance learning requirements, and to understand the challenges and barriers that the institutions face during this pandemic. And finally, which gets to the heart of today, seeking solutions to overcoming those challenges and barriers as expressed by HBCU, TCU leadership, faculty, and students. Now, we all know that broadband will provide HBCUs and TCUs with the enabling infrastructure essential to leverage a network of partnerships for creating competitive communities, and that broadband provides the required infrastructure for HBCUs and TCUs to deploy effective distance learning platforms. So the purpose of today, you might say, is a follow-on to our May teleconference with Christopher McCarran, Department of Ed, on the CARES Act, and to address questions you might have with regard to implementing and interpreting this act. So we want to help today provide a platform to help you untangle those complexities of those regulations. And so we have a panel of subject matter experts that are going to help us achieve those goals. And let me tell you who they are. Now, I'm just going to not do proper justice to all of them. I won't do, but I will give you a brief sketch of who they are. You can see their pictures on the screen, and there will be full-blown bio sketches and pictures for you to have at the end of this session when we post everything to our website. Dr. Reggie Smith currently serves as Chair Emeritus of the Board of Directors for the United States Distance Learning Association. He provides board leadership to the association, members, and partners, and promotes the development and application of distance learning for education and training, and serves the needs of all the distance learning community. I'm leaving out so much, Reggie, but the final thing I want to say is that we share the early experience and privilege of being engaged with the Black College Satellite Network in the late 1980s. Dr. Robbie Melton, Associate Vice President for the Smart Global Technology Innovation Center and Graduate Dean and Tenured Professor at Tennessee State University. She serves as a global researcher and international consultant for emerging Internet of Everything. Christopher McCarran, Deputy Assistant Secretary, Higher Education Programs, Office of Post-Secondary Education. Everybody has a mouthful for a time. U.S. Department of Education. He's also served as Executive Vice President and Provost, as well as Professor of Higher Education Leadership and Policy at the University of Mobile, where he more than tripled the institution's academic offerings. Jamie N. Studley, Esquire, became the 6th president of, I'll never get this right, of the WASC, College and Universities Commission in 2018. She was Deputy Undersecretary of the U.S. Department of Education from 2013 to 2016, and also acted during vacancies in the position of Undersecretary and Assistant Secretary for Post-Secondary Education. She served on the Federal Advisory Committee on Accreditation, National Advisory Committee on Institutional Quality and Integrity, and it goes on and on. Michael Goldstein, Esquire, Managing Director, Titan Partners, has a long history of close engagement with higher ed. Founding Director of New York City Urban Corps, which was the nation's first large-scale student intern program designed to support access for less affluent students. Dr. Lori Williams serves as president of the National Council for State Authorization Reciprocity Agreement, which provides reciprocity of state oversight of post-secondary distance education and advances critical consumer protections and accountability in distance education. She looks so young there that you'd never believe that she has had over 25 years experience in education in positions as provost, vice provost of curriculum development and innovation, vice president, executive director, and other administrative roles. That's our cast of characters. They're all first rate, marvelous, and we are so fortunate to have them with us today. Housekeeping rules. Before we start, here are a few rules of the road. We believe, I believe this to be the case when I wrote this, and Chris, you can tell me if it's still so, that all mics will be muted except the presenters. Yay or nay?
Yay.
Yes, yay. We want you to put all questions and comments in the chat box. And they will be addressed at the end of the presentation. A video of today's presentation, the PowerPoint deck, and transcriptions will be posted on the NTIA website, and USDLA will also have a link to these same materials. If we've not addressed all questions or you think there's need for additional time, we will discuss the possibility of hosting a distance learning regulations office hours teleconference. I turn it over to you, Dr. Smith III, to pick up the mantle, please.
All right. Well, and definitely, I'll definitely pass the ball to Robbie. Hi, my name is Reggie Smith from USDLA, and these are challenging times, and so this is really important for all of us to stay together, jump across multiple platforms, and address a wide variety of things, especially in the distance education arena, and really looking at the regulations that are going to come into effect and future regulations. And so, you know, the ball is constantly changing, and I think with a global audience now and the majority of the country we are going to address some old things, some new things. Broadband access is not a new phenomenon, and so there are things that we're gonna this pandemic has shined the light on and exposed some of the cracks in some of the areas that we really need to address. And so I'm grateful to have a panel here that's going to cover a lot of things with the regulations, whether it's reciprocity, academic engagement, clock hour, looking at correspondence to courses, institution eligibility. The list can go on and on, but this is a very important panel. And with that, I will pass to my cohort, Dr. Robbie Melton, and we'll kind of moderate and share and make sure we all just don't get in trouble, but have a little fun and pass on information. Robbie.
And good afternoon, everyone. Robbie Melton, Life is Good. We have an exciting agenda and distinguished panel members. So with that, I will be your chat moderator. So if you have any questions or comments, how about some recommendations? Please do not hesitate. Don't worry about any spelling error. I'll clean it up and present it. Life is good.
Okay, Reggie, will you pick up with moving the agenda along, please?
Absolutely, and I think right now we will, next up, we'll start off with a presentation from Chris. But before that, I wanted to definitely, next slide with the presentations and really kind of give an idea what the roadmap is going to look like for this presentation in this webinar. We'll have presentation, discussion, and conclusion. Next slide. I definitely would like to thank NTIA and the Department of Education for jumping on this program and bringing it to us to really partner. And also I have to be thankful to our sponsors as an association, as a .org. We cannot engage with other bodies that are here today without the support of a lot of folks. Next slide. With that said, we'll kick it into presentations and give Chris the driving steering wheel to really give us a runway on what he's seeing from the Department of Education and kind of the kickstart for this panel here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Reggie, and I appreciate everybody taking the time to join. I've got to switch over so that I can control the PowerPoint on my end. I'm hopefully joined this morning by Greg Martin, who's the Director of Policy Development here in the Office of Post-Secondary Education, and the guru on all things distance ed. Greg, can you hear us?
I can, yes.
Great. Now I just got to figure out how to control my PowerPoint, and then...
And not your email.
Not my email. Can everybody see the PowerPoint now?
No.
There
Yes.
we go.
Now
There's
it's up.
There it is.
Got it.
Okay. So Greg, we're on, and Greg's going to walk us through this. I'll provide commentary as needed, and we hope this will answer a lot of these questions you have. This PowerPoint was originally produced for the recently held Federal Student Aid Conference, which I know many of you had opportunity to attend. But with that, Greg, why don't you give us the highlights?
Okay, of course, yeah, I don't have as much time here as I would normally, so I'm going to pick and choose what to highlight here from the presentation. And of course, you have access to the presentation if you want to read through the entire thing. So, in looking at what we have here, let's just go to slide 3, Chris. So you'll see here that we did a notice of proposed rulemaking on this regulation back in April, and we had a comment period that extended until May 4. We published final regulations on the 2nd of September this year, and these regulations will be effective July 1, 2021. However, we have offered early implementation for any or all of these provisions, so you can determine that you want to implement the entire package, or you can implement by section. So you could, for instance, say that we only want to implement 668.22 that's pertinent to R2T for early. You cannot implement a part of a section and not part of another. So a section would be like .22, 668.8, things like that. So that section we have to be implemented in its entirety. So you can pick and choose sections or implement the entire package. Nothing in the package requires, very little in the package requires any additional burden from schools. It's mostly all on the side of giving schools additional flexibility. So a lot of schools have decided to implement early. If you decide to implement early, you have to have there's no official notification to Ed necessary. All you need to do is to notate somewhere at your institution that an individual who is designated with the authority to make such decisions has decided that your institution will implement these regulations early. So that could be a dean, a chief financial officer, president, anybody designated that authority. You would just put a letter somewhere, make it known that you are implementing the regulations in their entirety or by section, and when you are doing that. So nothing formal there, but it should exist so that a reviewer or auditor would be able to see, looking back, that yes, you did implement these early. Okay, let's move on to the next slide, Chris, slide 4. This just talks about academic engagement and the whole idea of determining, whether a student has is actually considered to be in attendance at an academically related event. And there was no definition of academic engagement in the current regulations. We did have something in R2T4 that was related to that, but it pertained only to R2T4. So if we go to the next slide, slide 5, you'll see that we have now defined academic engagement. Most of what we had in the R2T4 regulations was moved over here and put into this definition of academic engagement under Part 600, which is, of course, institutional eligibility. So now this definition would be applicable for all purposes related to Title IV. So it specifies that academic engagement includes an interactive tutorial or webinar. So we've always had questions about that. And it clarifies that merely logging into a class or online tutorial is not considered to be academic engagement. Moving on to slide 6. I don't know if we have any schools on this call who are clock hour. Don't want to spend a lot of time on it. It's not going. Do we have any schools on here that measure progress in clock hours, or schools credit hour traditional schools?
I'd say we have a broad range of historically Black colleges and universities and a broad range of tribal colleges and universities represented on that call.
Probably not.
So I don't know how to answer that
Yeah,
question.
my guess is that. So historically, Black
probably
colleges and universities are traditional. So I'm thinking that there's not going to be a lot of interest in this. It could be that maybe some of the tribally controlled institutions may have some programs that they offer more career-oriented programs that are clock hour, but I do offer these definitions here if you want to view them, but I will not take time to go over them today. So I'll skip past that slide. Let's move on to credit hour definition on slide 7, which is something which is a lot more applicable to all of you. We have revised slightly the definition of a credit hour to be an amount of student work defined by instruction as approved by the institution's accrediting agency or state approval agency, consistent with commonly accepted practice in post-secondary education. And we've retained these time measures. And I note that we start here by saying, and this is the case in the regulation, that it reasonably approximates, not less than 1 hour of classroom instruction and direct faculty instruction, and a minimum of 2 hours of out-of-class work for approximately 15 weeks or 1 semester or trimester hour of credit, or 10 to 12 weeks for a quarter. And we've added to that at least the equivalent amount of work of this definition for other academic activities, including lab work, internships, practica, studio work. And one of the things we've stressed here with this new definition is that you may take into account a variety of delivery methods and also different measures of student work, different academic calendars, disciplines, degree levels. So again, your definition of a credit hour is, we've maintained some of those things that go back to the Carnegie unit. That's 1 and 2 there, but letting schools know that we are allowing a little more flexibility with respect to what constitutes a credit hour. We have made some on slide 8. We'll move to slide 8. We do have some changes here that we made with respect to correspondence courses. I don't doubt many of you use correspondence. You probably have distance education, but not correspondence. The two are different. We have referred now to instructors rather than instructor to recognize that there could be multiple instructors involved. And we've also defined what a correspondence student is. that would be someone whose enrollment in correspondence constitutes more than 50% of the courses in which he or she is enrolled for that year. And we have not to date defined correspondence student before these regulations. Let's move on to slide 10, distance education. This is probably of interest to many of you. I would imagine most of your institutions on this call today have some sort of distance education offered by the institution, whether it is part of a program or it might even be an entire program. So we have changed those definitions somewhat, and you'll note that this is a bit of a liberalization of what's allowable for distance education, while still maintaining those program integrity standards that we feel we need to differentiate between distance education and correspondence. So in distance education now, we've defined the instructor or instructors rather than simply the instructor. And again, this is to recognize that a lot of these courses are taught via teams, not just the traditional one professor in front of the classroom, only this time it's virtual. So we are taking that into account. We eliminated references to outdated technologies such as DVDs, CD-ROM, and just replaced those references with other media to take into account the development of these media over the years. We don't want to tie ourselves in these regulations to something that 20 years from now will seem, or even 5 years from now, may seem obsolete. And we define the instructor as the individual responsible for delivering course content and who meets the qualifications for instruction established by the institution's accrediting agency. So that's important. Whenever you see the word instructor used with reference to distance education, that's what we mean by an instructor. So you do want to work closely with your accreditor to make certain that the individual you're defining as the instructor does meet those qualifications for instruction that are established by your accreditation agency. On slide 11, this has to do, the thing that separates distance education from correspondence, from really correspondence, is the idea of there being regular and substantive interaction between the student and the instructors, which does not occur in correspondence. So prior to this, we've never really had a definition of what we mean by a substantive interaction, and that's been a cause for a lot of confusion over the past couple of years. So here we define it. Substantive interaction would be defined under distance education as engaging students in teaching, learning, and assessment consistent with content under discussion and including two of the following. So these, in the regulations, we are defining it as providing two of the list of five there. So you see the 5 things. The substantive interaction must involve at least 2 of those 5 in order for it to be considered substantive. If none of those are met, then it would not be substantive, and what you would have would be correspondence, not distance education. So that is a change and somewhat of a providing more latitude with respect to what constitutes substantive interaction than we have done in the past. Remember, we said substantive and regular. So on slide 12, on the next slide, you see that we define regular. You're required to provide regular interaction between a student and an instructor in a distance education environment. And all we're saying here is to, prior to the student's completion of the course or competency, provide the opportunity for substantive interactions with the student on a predictable and regular basis, commensurate with the length, and monitor the academic engagement and success. And make sure that substantive interaction with the students there when needed and certainly upon request. So this, again, we're not saying that regular interaction has to be 3 times a week or this many times a semester. This has to be something done on a regular basis. And it also has to give the opportunity for the student, whenever necessary, to interact with that instructor. Okay, let's, hold on a second, I lost my own place here, and that's unfortunate. I'm going to skip over the definition. We did change on slide 13 the definition and clarification of what constitutes an incarcerated student, but I don't know how many of you run programs for those individuals. If you do, you want to take a look at that. We don't really have time to go into that today, so I'm going to skip past that. I'm also going to skip past direct assessment and subscription based, because I don't feel that's going to be something which is of use of concern to many of you. Yeah, let's skip on to slide 23, Chris, because I want to look at things that are going to affect everybody in the short period of time I have with you all today. So on slide 23, we see a reference to written arrangements. So these are written arrangements include what you probably refer to as consortium agreements. That's agreements between you and another institution that allow your students to attend that institution, take coursework there, and have that coursework transferred back to your institution under this arrangement. A contractual arrangement would be with an entity that is not eligible where students were taking courses. And in most cases, you're probably having your students take courses at another college or university. Maybe it's nearby, could even be overseas, probably study abroad. But those are all written arrangements, and we've made some clarifications with respect to written arrangements. We've made some pretty substantial changes with these regulations. So one of the things we were trying to do was address workforce responsiveness. And you'll note here that we allow you to align or modify your curriculum in order to meet the recommendations of industry advisory boards, control boards, and allow you to do that as an alternative to allowing or requiring faculty control over the approval or industry recognized credential. So just letting you know that we are expanding what you can do with respect to these written arrangements. We have now put into place the formula for determining the percentage of a program that's offered by an ineligible entity. As you know, there are limitations on that, and the percentage determined by taking the number of credit or clock hours provided by the ineligible entity and dividing that by the number of credit or clock hours in the program. We do note here in this bottom bullet, this is an important change. The written arrangements requirements do not apply to internships or externship portions of a program if that internship or externship is governed by accreditation agency standards or the standards of an outside entity that require the oversight and supervision of the institution where the institution is responsible for the internship or externship, and all students are monitored by qualified institutional personnel. So this just points out that if you have internship arrangements, and it meets these requirements, that it's not considered to be to fall under the regulations that are pertinent to written arrangements, and it would not be subject to those restrictions. And we actually built that into the regulation. Next slide, 24, I'm going to skip. That's the clock credit hour conversion formula. If you are a clock hour institution, you'll want to be, you know what, though I do want to take that back, because this might even be where you don't use clock hours. So clock credit hour conversion, I don't know how many of you use it. This is on slide 24. But if you have a program that is less than 2 years in length and it is a gainful employment program, or it does not lead to a degree or certificate, then it's required that that program do a clock to credit hour conversion and have so many clock hours per credit hour. And I don't know, those of you who have programs like this, I'm sure you're aware that this applies to you. I just want to point out that we have changed the conversion formula from 37.5 to 1 back to 30 to 1 per semester or trimester hours. And we no longer look at outside homework or factors outside the classroom are no longer taken into consideration for that calculation. Probably doesn't affect many of you, but some of you out there may have programs like this. Let's move on to slide 25. You all have these program participation agreement, and this is this talks about the relationship between that program length and entry-level requirements. And again, this has to do with clock hours. I just want to point it out that it's there. You want to be aware of it if you have clock hour programs. And you know, if you look at this and have some questions and you have clock hours, feel free to email those to me. But I don't think it affects the majority of you. So you all have program participation agreements, but many of you do not have this, do not have clock hour programs, so this would not be applicable. Let's go on to slide 26, satisfactory academic progress. I didn't talk about subscription-based programs. So few schools use them and have them. It's certainly important for that subset of institutions. But if you have a subscription-based program, we no longer require SAP for subscription-based programs. Just want to point that out. I'm not going to say anything more about that. Let's move on to slide 27. If you have any non-term credit hour programs without terms or clock hour programs, we have removed the SAP PACE calculation. All of you know, obviously, if you're in a traditional environment with credit hours, that satisfactory academic progress consists of two measures. One is the qualitative measure, or grade point average. Students have to have a certain grade point average to be making progress. The other aspect is this quantitative measure, which is PACE, which is the student, the student takes 12 credit hours in one semester. Out of the credits he's attempted or she's attempted, how many are completed? We do this PACE evaluation. We've removed that for non-term credit hour and clock hour programs because of the requirement in those programs that a student cannot receive a second or subsequent disbursement until 1/2 the weeks or hours in the academic year are completed. So that was a redundant requirement, and I've been wanting to get rid of it for about 20 years. Finally had the opportunity to do it, and it's gone. So might affect you if you have a traditional environment, and I'm sure most of you do. That would be, credit hours with semesters, trimesters, or quarters. Of course, you still do have to do a PACE calculation for SAP in addition to your looking at the student's grades. Slide 28. Slide 28. Let's talk about maximum time frame. Maximum time frame, and this affects all of you. All of your programs have a maximum time frame measure, and for undergraduate programs, that can be no more than 150% of the published length of the program, and the vast majority of you do it in terms of credit hours. So if you have typically you have an undergraduate program of, let's say, 120 hours in length, and so 150% of that would be 180 hours, and so the student has to complete 120 hours within 180 hours of attempts, right? So, and that's always easy to do that calculation, and because you're doing it in terms of credit hours completed, attempted versus those that are completed, that always takes into account fluctuating enrollment statuses, full-time, part-time, half-time, rather three-quarter time. Here you see what we did was we're allowing programs measuring credit hours, all of probably most of you, to have the option of expressing the time frame in terms of calendar time. Most of you probably won't want to do this because if you say I have a 4-year program, that means 6 years. How do you account for students who are going half time? Obviously, the students will take longer. When you do it the way you currently do it in terms of credit hours completed versus those attempted, that calculation always takes that into account. This doesn't, but there are some programs that are lockstep, different types of programs where institutions wanted the option of using calendar time for the maximum time frame, and you now have it.
Hey,
moving on
Greg,
to yes,
Greg, this is Reggie. I'm for the sake of time, I'm going to keep pushing us along and pray. Are there any fantastic amount of information in it? I want to just let everybody know we're going to put these slides out so we can make sure they're shared. Are any other last minute pieces that you or Chris want to say, and then I'll go ahead and move the floor over to Lori and remind everyone if you have some comments, please put them in the chat section and questions so we can make sure as we move through this program, the panelists will be able to respond back, and or we can take these questions up offline.
Sure. I just point out in the last one, I'd move on to slide 30 here, and just want to point out the last thing I would say that affects all of you. Slide 31, I'm sorry, are these changes in R2T for requirements. And on slide 32, you want to take a look at that because we've broadened the treatment of modules. So right now, this is a big change.
I know.
Anytime a student completes more than 49% or more of a semester, if a module is 49% or more of a semester, where they complete a combination of modules that equal that, or they complete at least half time the number of credits, that student's not considered to be withdrawn anymore. So that's a huge change from what we currently have. So you want to make sure that you review those slides and are familiar with the rules regarding modules if you have programs that have modules in them. So I would leave it at that.
And
that's pretty much.
I will just add, I'll add, and thanks to Greg. Like I said, he is the guru expert on this. We will make these slides, all of these slides, available to all participants today, and Greg and I will be here to answer any questions that you have as well. And don't ever hesitate to reach out to us after the fact as well. And thank you for the opportunity to present.
Excellent. I really appreciate you taking the time today, Greg and Chris, to really address the audience as we navigate our families in the home and kids are in school and running around. With that, we'll pass it back over to Lori Williams to go ahead and brief us on what her organization is doing, what she's seeing with regulations and policies. Lori, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Reggie, and thank you very much, Francine and Robbie, for inviting me to share with you all today. Next slide, please. I serve as the president of the National Council for State Authorization Reciprocity Agreements, and as Francine said, all of our titles are really a mouthful. We're better known as NC-SARA. My organization began just about 7 years ago when a group in 2013 came together of higher education stakeholders, state regulators, education leaders, accreditors, the Department of Education and institutions, in order to establish the state authorization reciprocity agreements. It streamlines distance education regulations for programs. We expand students' access to educational opportunities and ensure more efficient, consistent, and effective regulation of distance learning programs. We're a voluntary agreement amongst 49 member states and the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. And as of this month, we have over 2,000 institutions that participate. This represents more than 90% of those academic institutions in the United States that offer distance education. We're open to all degree-granting institutions, and they pay between $2,000 and $6,000 annually based on enrollment to participate, which is up to 30 times less than they would have to pay state by state in order to be able to obtain authorization to operate across state lines. Participating colleges and universities adhere to stringent requirements, including the requirement that institutions be accredited and remain in good financial standing. Some benefits of SARA include distance education program quality improvements. It's easier for students to access online courses across state lines and remain in their programs when they move. We've got a very mobile workforce these days. It reduces costs and bureaucracy for states and institutions, improves coordination between states on higher education opportunities, provides valuable oversight of distance education programs, and shares out-of-state learning experience data like clinical hours and practice teaching. Next slide, please. Now, with these most recent regulations that Christopher talked about that came out in September, there were not any that pertain specifically to NC-SARA requirements. However, back in July, we made modifications to align with federal regulations that mean new language in our SARA policy manual. What's important to note is that this requirement now just aligns with the language that the federal government is requiring of academic institutions. And this is for all academic institutions. They must disclose whether their programs that one would think would lead to licensure do in fact lead to licensure in every state. We've had this requirement in place at NC-SARA since the inception of our organization. And institutions, the two differences are that, of course, We apply this to non-Title IV institutions, which is not a requirement of the federal government. And we're also requiring institutions to provide contact information for those licensing boards when an institution can't determine after all reasonable efforts whether their course or program will meet licensing requirements in those states. I'll also add that on our website, we have a directory of program licensing agencies for the top 5 licensure programs: education, nursing, mental health counseling, social work, and psychology. So that provides a benefit to institutions that are seeking that information for the licensing contact information. Next slide, please. So my presentation was short and sweet. There's not a lot about federal regulations that have impacted NC-SARA, but if you have any other questions, please contact us at info@ncsara.org and go to our website for a great number of resources. For those that are not participating in NC-SARA, we also host a state authorization guide, which provides valuable information about state authorization outside of SARA for every state across the United States. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Reggie.
All right. Well, thank you. Very, very informative. And again, all of this content will be available. NC-SARA is a great organization, and really take the opportunity to really engage with them. With that, I'm going to hand the ball off to Jamie. Next up in our line of discussions.
Michael. Reggie, I think Michael, it works better if Michael goes first.
All right, let me Mike, you're up, and we'll switch it around. So skip a slide down, next slide down to Mike, and we'll and Mike has some slides. Yep, there we go.
Well,
Mike,
Jamie, thank you. I actually anticipated going in the other direction, so I'm shuffling my papers around.
Oh.
But you're an accreditor, so you call the shots, so it's fine. I'm good.
And Reggie,
just one tidbit. There was some gap between the time that I helped create the New York City Urban Corps and my role presently with Titan Partners, where I am co-creator of the Center for Higher Education Transformation, which is a very interesting enterprise. But for about 40 years, I was an attorney in higher education. I headed the practice at my firm and spent a lot of time working on trying to get a regulatory system that was hospitable to an innovation, particularly the use of technology in higher education and the use of alternative learning modalities. So I'm very gratified by the directionality that we're getting now at the end of the current administration. And it really follows changes that were made in the previous administration when Ted Mitchell was the undersecretary for whom Jamie worked, where there really was substantial movement towards getting the differences of technology-based learning embedded in a regulatory framework that we have to remember was basically established in the 1960s. And for those of you who were born then, you will remember that new technology was the touch-tone telephone. The internet was still 20 some odd years away. Online learning was 30 or so years away. So what we're dealing with is a regulatory framework that was not designed for anything other than really two alternatives. One was instructor-led, face-to-face classroom education, and the other, which essentially was excluded from access to federal student aid, was correspondence study. And that's really all that was out there. And you fast forward a half century, and you realize that, and we've really had this brought into sharp focus with the response to COVID-19, the remarkable changes that higher education has undergone in being able to serve students other than face-to-face in a classroom. Now, the emergency change to remote learning is a mixed blessing, because some of it was done exceedingly well and some of it by necessity not so much. And I think the lesson that we're learning is that this is a complex area that needs to be done carefully and well, and not inexpensively, and that's an important aspect. The other component is that recognizing that the regulatory system, whether it is the U.S. Department of Education for student aid, whether it's state governments in terms of authorizing institutions to operate, or whether it's accreditors who determine qualitatively whether educational program is sufficient to get their stamp of approval, all needed to modify their rules, modify their operations to meet the emergency. I would say the one that needed the least modifications were probably the accreditors, because they have, I think, been ahead of the game in recognizing the necessity of changing what they did and how they did it to accommodate the fundamental changes in learning. I think the Department of Education was certainly accommodating in suspending rules for approval of transition to online learning, as have the states been. But there are a few takeaways from the new regulatory package, and Jamie is going to do a little bit of Back to the Future in talking about a regulatory package that was about 5 months ago that spoke directly to the roles of accreditors. This package speaks more to the interaction between the Department of Education and institutions, but it has a very, very important component that is really, in my view, overarching. And it's really the first, if you go to the first slide in our set, I think it's slide 15 in the group presentation. Move, there we go, okay. And what it basically says is that previously the department had to approve institutions' direct assessment programs at each credential level. And that has been changed to saying that only the first direct assessment program, and direct assessment covers a multitude of modalities, needs approval by the Office of Student Financial Aid. Beyond that, they simply, department has to advise the secretary of such changes. Likewise, that written arrangements for institutions to do things with, quote, ineligible institutions, and that is a provider that is not itself an accredited state authorized institution, now requires notice, and it's only when more than 25% of a program is offered and less than 50% of a program. Beyond 50% is still in a different, much more restricted category. But this is the Department of Education stepping away from regulation. This does not change the responsibility of institutions to report to their accreditors and seek the approval of their accreditors where the accreditors require that approval. We really have to distinguish between the Department of Education, which is responsible for the administration of Title IV, and the accreditors, which are responsible for institutional integrity. And the accreditors' rules are not driven by the Department of Education, although to a certain extent they have been circumscribed. And Jamie, I think, is going to talk about the reduction in that circumscription that occurred by virtue of an earlier rulemaking, which I think is extremely important. Would you flip to the next slide, please? Important, and this was mentioned in the discussion by the Department of Education, flexibility in modifying curricula at the recommendation of industry advisory boards without relying on a traditional faculty-led decision-making process. This is a really tricky regulatory change because, again, I'm going to completely defer to Jamie on this, but it raises an issue of an institution saying, well, the Department of Education says we can do this. This is a issue of core academic conduct on the part of the institution. And it is the accreditors that regulate that core academic content, not the Department of Education. So the fact the department says you can do what you need to do based upon recommendations of industry advisory boards does not, in my view at least, diminish the authority and responsibility of accreditors to review whether a change in curriculum has in fact been carried out consistent with what is good academic process. Now that doesn't translate to, quote, traditional faculty-led decision-making. There's nothing inherently right or inherently wrong with traditional faculty-led decision-making. There are multiple ways that institutions make these decisions. This is not open season. Remember that your accreditors still are your primary arbiters in this area. Now, what is, I think, really important is, again, a stepping back of the Department of Education from a overly intrusive, I think, role. And this is the secretary will rely on the requirements established by an institution's accrediting agency or state authorizing agency. But this is primarily going to be the accreditor. To evaluate an institution's appeal of a final audit or program review that includes a finding about the institution's classification of a course or program as distance education or the assignment of credit hours. Now, I'm sure everyone is looking at that and says, well, hell, that only means if we got caught and we're fighting a battle with the Department of Education. I think it goes beyond that, because what it is saying is that the final arbiter of whether a program is distance education or something else, and the something else would typically be correspondence, or how an institution ascribes credit hours, is a decision that in the final analysis will be made by the accrediting agency or the state, not the Department of Education. Now, this follows the basic premise that determining academic integrity, that determining the nature of the academic program, what is or is not good academic conduct, is not a responsibility of our federal government. We do not have a Ministry of Education. We have a Department of Education, and that is intentional in that the Department of Education is a funding agency. It is not primarily an academic regulating agency. So I think, again, this is an important provision, not only if you're engaged in what could be a huge program review audit with the Department of Education. There was one that was just resolved this past year that had a potential liability of just south of $1 billion. And I know $1 billion is not a whole lot these days, but for an institution, that's still a fair amount of money. And it was resolved in favor of the department, basically consistent with this change in regulation, and the department put that in practice. A question I will raise back to our friends from the department is whether, when the department said that an institution is free to implement the regulations in advance of July 1, and the question I would pose is whether the department is also deferring to the regulations prior to July 1. And that's unstated, and I think it would be useful to have an answer to that. I don't know if our friends from the department are still on the line, but I think we can follow up on that, Reggie. Next slide, please. Okay, and a couple of points now on really in a summary, and I've taken this in a less deep than I think the department's discussion. I think it's the reason for this is not a session for Title IV administrators. This is a session for university executives. Very important statement. In the announcement, ED said, this is directly from the Department of Education, institutions that choose to offer these programs will benefit from the classification of terms and processes involved in establishing and administering direct assessment and reduced barriers to entry. Okay, that's an important statement. While those currently offering such programs or competency-based courses will be best positioned to offer new programs in the near term, we expect additional institutions to take advantage of the opportunities to offer new programs. This is an open invitation to other providers to come in and fill the interstices, always a tough word, between what institutions are doing and what learners are seeking. The next paragraph, while it's more a function of continued evolution in the post-secondary market, removing the barriers to entry will increase competition, and some institutions could face a cost associated with losing students to those that offer appealing new programs. Now, this is really a clarion call to existing institutions that if there are spaces that you can fill by being more imaginative, by being transformational in what you deliver, in how you reach students, in how you educate, if you can develop programs that are faster and cheaper and better, you will have a competitive advantage. Conversely, if you don't, what the department is saying, and I think this is without anyone really disagreeing, if institutions don't do that, the department at least is saying there are others who are going to come in, and what we have put together, in fact, will encourage that. And I think also Jamie will speak to where the regulations affecting accreditors have also, in fact, somewhat opened the door. Last of my slides, please. There we go. Okay. And again, this is a repeat of the previous, that students, especially non-traditional, and that is going to be the new market. We know to absolute certainty that the number of traditional students has flattened and in many states has declined and declined precipitously. If institutions are going to prosper, they have to reach out to a broader cohort of students, especially non-traditional, that find the existing competency-based or distance education programs appealing for various reasons and benefit from flexible pacing and different models for assessing progress. Again, the department is saying, we encourage this, and I think what we are hearing from the accreditors and from funding agencies is that we agree, come up with better ways to serve students with greater flexibility. We will be supportive. Final statement. While competency-based models are a relatively new segment of the post-secondary market, and yes and no, if you consider 40 years relatively new, sure, but it's been around for about 40 years. Evidence suggests, and I would strike some, strong evidence suggests that the self-pacing model and other efforts by institutions to accommodate other scheduling demands of students have, and to recognize knowledge and skills gained elsewhere, may allow students to graduate with lower debt. I would add, and graduate with a better, more complete, more useful education. So what we have in this rules package, and we heard from the department, was a lot of the technicality of the rule package, the things that your financial aid managers, administrators are going blind looking at. But I think the real takeaway is that with these two rule packages, and again, Jamie's going to talk about the first one as well, there is an opening now for institutions to engage more aggressively in finding new and better ways to serve students. Now, I mentioned earlier that what I'm doing at Titan Partners is co-heading the Center for Higher Education Transformation. This is what it's all about. It's about finding new ways to be transformative in higher education. This is not a unique phenomenon for this administration, and I know there are a lot of people who have a knee-jerk reaction with regard to this Department of Education. This is a continuation of what started, in fact, in the Bush administration in an overarching review of accreditation and institutional oversight that then was picked up by the Obama administration in new initiatives, and I think has been carried forward here. So this is, in a really startling degree, a bipartisan conclusion of what needs to happen in higher education. I think the challenge, and the challenge particularly to the institutions to whom this particular webinar is addressed, is taking advantage of these changes, of being in front of the pack rather than following it. That is a challenge, and is a challenge particularly for institutions that have resource constraints, but it is an opportunity to really change the dynamic. And I'll be happy to respond to questions in the latter half of the program.
Wonderful presentation, Mike. I appreciate the time you took and just been humble. And for everyone that's on here, you know, these regulations really, you know, Francine and the department, everyone coming together to really help you navigate a tent that is now bulging with everyone inside it. And so the bodies that are here have been in this space for some time. You have questions or comments, please put them in the chat. Robbie, who is also the public policy chair for USDLA, sits there and also engages with Mike on the committee and everyone else here. So we're here to help and keep everyone that's trying to do the right thing, the good actors in the right lane, and those that are bad actors, we're keeping an eye and trying to push those out the system, definitely. So it's a big tent. With that being said, I will hike the ball over to Jamie, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. And now I'm happy to grab it. Thank you very much, Reggie. It's a pleasure to be here with supporting presenters, USDLA, the Department and Commerce, and NC Sarah's longstanding support. I'm pleased to be back talking with so many tribal colleges and HBCUs that I've enjoyed working with in the past. So I'm sorry we're not physically present. I'm also, you've heard the line, all that's standing between you and lunch. In this case, all that's standing between us and getting to the questions you really want to know about. So I will try to be brief and at a very high level. The first thing I want to comment on is access, because when broadband is part of the invitation to a conversation, I think we can't discuss these issues without acknowledging the challenge of delivery that so many institutions, not just yours, but everyone trying to reach students who had broadband issues, and the connection of that with accessibility to the way people are learning today. Ted Mitchell from ACE and I did an op-ed in the spring in the Hechinger report, which I will arrange to have posted for you, about the challenges of broadband reaching all learners from K through graduate education, trying to seek federal funding supports. There are state programs that address access issues. This is a rural issue, an economic issue, a center city issue. I live in a big tech organized city where the connections are not adequate for learners in their homes in many different ways. And I know that's a challenge that some of you have in particular. The tribal access issues have been written up extensively, and so have those for students who have their own small children or share signal with a household of other learners. So I just want to respect and acknowledge that that is, as with so many things, we can talk about the dream and the ambition, but we have the realities of true access right in front of us that control whether people can really achieve their goals and their ambitions. Having said that, just a quick word about distance education generally and its evolution. It's fascinating to see how something that seemed like the other. I was at the Department of Education during the Clinton administration when distance education was a great big question mark, however venerable Mike reminds us it is. And we thought we needed a completely set of rules for how to think about it. But increasingly, I know WASC and many other
people whose thinking I respect in this field, have recognized that it's one more form of education, but the same standards, the same expectations, the same questions apply when we're thinking about distance education. We think about fundamental questions of curriculum design, learning objectives, assessment, whether standards are being met, whether all students are being reached, whether there are learning gaps. A good accreditor does not, in my view, determine for you, doesn't get involved in whether you choose to teach a subject by seminar or by lecture, whether an externship would be a good way to complement a course that you're providing. And increasingly, that determination about whether an institution has the capacity, once determining that it has the capacity to use distance modalities for delivering education, less and less, I think, are we going to get into when you choose to use which model. Interestingly, we realized we don't have a definition for hybrid education, although that is may turn out to be the winner. The appropriate mix is determined by faculty members about how best to organize a program, its delivery, and students' achievement of their learning goals. So there's a lot of change. For us at WASC, one of the centerpieces is we tell institutions what, not how. What standards you have to meet, what objectives, what we want to understand about what you're doing, and not how to get there. And as we think about when is distance just one more way to accomplish the purpose, or is it a different creature that requires different rules, that's a principle that comes back to us. I have really two main points that I'm going to make. One is to redeem my promise that I would talk about some changes in the accreditation landscape. But the first one is something that is almost buried within the July 2020 new regulations, but clearly very powerful in how all of us are thinking about post-secondary education. And that is thinking more seriously about outcomes and results. Accreditation moved the field forward some years ago in saying, let's not just think about teaching, let's understand learning and how we understand and assess learning, and moving the field to encourage institutions, indeed I'll use the dreaded word, require institutions to be more attentive to whether what they meant students to learn and be able to do was actually being accomplished. What were your expectations? Could students do what you hoped at the end of a program and know what you wanted them to know? And if not, how was that going to loop back into the program design to assure that the learning was taking place successfully? So we've seen that focus on student learning outcomes. We've seen models like competency-based education that go right at that kind of question. And happily, we're seeing increased flexibility about the credit hour because I think we all understand seat time is not the best way to understand learning effectiveness. I think we are very close to perhaps the demise of credit hour altogether, but that will only happen when, returning to that word outcomes, we have sufficient understanding of whether learning is taking place at a level that's satisfactory to the institution and to meeting its mission. But the more we understand and can compare and make sensible, not bright line judgments, but have sensible conversations with institutions about results for students, the more we can let some of these mechanics along the way, or the surrogates for learning, drop away and concentrate on what really matters, which is student success. Right now, we have some tools, many of us would say some limited tools, but we'll use them as thoughtfully as we can. Graduation rates, repayment, employment, earnings. Creative people are working to develop others that are more insightful. But an important context for all of that is to put that information into the reality of the setting, the institution, the students, the program mix, and to acknowledge external forces that affect outcomes. I probably talked to some of you or to your colleagues in the development of the college scorecard by the U.S. Department of Education, which was very controversial at the outset. And we had really important discussions with HBCUs and tribal colleges at that time about how to reflect the differences in the student population, preparation, institutional resources, and the systemic bias that students may face when they complete a program. If we know that by race, ethnicity, and gender people are paid less, then we can't create bright lines about earnings, because that would be completely unfair to the institutions who are educating the students who face those biases in the workforce. The list goes on and on. WASC has done a lot recently to provide that information on a more systematic basis and to put it in context as we think about peer groupings for institutions that make sense. But through all of it, we are respecting the theme that Walter Kimbrough and I, we're not sure which of us said it first, but when Walter, still president of Dillard, and I both referred to the difficulty of the dive. We have to, I think we're at a moment where we can use outcomes better to understand where institutions are actually providing degrees with value and meaning for students, and make sure that those that are not improve or depart the scene if necessary, so that we're sure that all accredited institutions appropriately serve their students, but not to do so in a blunt way, but to do it in a subtle way that reflects those differences and the difficulty of the dive that schools are taking on, or the difficulty of the challenges that their students face, whether, even if they got a fine education, so that we make that outcome analysis logical. And now for the quite different, but I think in some ways these things will link up. The July regulations that were also part of the negotiated rulemaking discussions that led to the distance education changes also led to changes for accreditors, particularly the historically regional accreditors that had identified their scope by a set of states. So WASC, for example, has historically, and our scope is still listed at the department as California, Hawaii, and the Pacific Basin, along with international institutions. There's another accreditor that specializes, that focuses on the geographic region of the South, SAC-COC, and others in New England and Middle States and heartland of the country. While we could always have changed our scope and asked the department to allow us to operate with an expanded set of states or nationally, the regulations highlighted the nature of this regional arrangement and made it easier for accreditors to say, you know, I'd like to go beyond the map that we now have. Although I think that some of the reasons that were given for why this was necessary are a genuine problem about transfer in search of a solution that is not related to this issue. The flexibility that has been provided to accreditors, to regional accreditors, to allow us to expand that scope has been taken up. WASC's commission in February decided that we would be open to accrediting institutions from anywhere in the country, starting initially with institutions that had some connection with us, either with current institutions or part of a system where we were already accrediting. And we are now, in a quiet way, open to going beyond that, and are talking to institutions that think that we and the approach that we use might be of interest to them. Another regional accreditor, Middle States, has also signaled that it is open to changes. if this works well, it could promote different approaches to or communities of accreditation that think about innovation or review and standards in different ways. Another positive possibility is that institutions that are already national. I mean, one observation when this was done is we are based in the Bay Area. There are institutions from all over the country that have institutional elements, branches, and units where we are. An institution could decide what style, what theory of accreditation it wanted to participate with, and where there was a good match in the way their institution wanted to promote their own institutional improvement. And we can also specialize. Somebody could say, we're going to get really good at competency-based education. Another could say, we have particular types of challenge or learning styles or scales of institutions. So WASC is thinking about where we can have the most impact, and consistent with our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion in education. We know that effectiveness and commitment to DEI, to using outcomes to understand student performance, and innovative academic program will all be part of what we will be looking at as we think about what institutions beyond the ones currently in our geographic region might be of interest to us. The challenge on the broad policy level is to get the best of a new arrangement, the potential for innovation or natural migration if institutions either decide to move accreditors or new institutions are given more choices about what accreditor they can work with. The challenge is to get the benefits of possible variation while maintaining the rigorousness of accreditation. It's in nobody's interest for accreditation to be too easy. That doesn't serve students, it doesn't serve the credibility of higher education. And we want to think of this as a race to the top, where we, to the extent that we use the word competition, which the department uses frequently for this new environment, that the competition is for promoting quality, for helping institutions accomplish what they want in ways that are flexible but provide the necessary oversight to assure continued quality. The worry in the opposite direction would be if competition among existing accreditors and the new accreditors who have a slightly easier pathway to be approved by the department should turn into a race to the bottom, in which it's too easy to be accredited and students are disserved in the process. With that, I think all of us see a horizon in which new opportunities for programs, new chances for partnerships, some additional flexibility in delivery models can help institutions achieve their goals. But to the extent that many of the institutions on this call are relatively small, and that the resources that are certainly not allocated equitably across higher education, meeting those challenges and helping institutions like yours do that, to be informed, to be able to participate in the most interesting of the opportunities and partnerships is very much on the minds of many of us in higher education who want to be sure that your institutions and your students succeed. With that, Reggie, back to you and our question providers.
There you go. Well, that was a fantastic presentation, and very important and timely discussion. As we move to the discussion period, really, folks that have questions, please make sure you put them in the chat so Dr. Milton can grab those and throw those out. But I really just open it up to the floor to kind of discuss some of the topics that we covered today. And I think you know, how these regulations will really come into play in 2021. And you know, I probably have a little question based on what we've seen with the pandemic. Are there some things that you think will definitely need to be addressed and changed and morphed? Which I heard a thread of this across everyone, looking at competency and outcomes, and state reciprocity, and broadband access, and historically Black and Native American institutions, and how they navigate these seas. I think that the pandemic has kind of really opened the broader tent to more people to the discussions that you're going to have here. And Robbie, do you have any questions that may have come in from any of the attendees that the panels may want to special address?
Well, do I have questions? Yes. On behalf of the audience, thank you. And then I'm going to start with the last and go up. Panelists, question, issue that is faced in public education between selecting public ed versus private schools with the voucher programs. Can you comment on that?
Okay, I'll throw myself into the fire. We have a voucher program right now. The title for higher education, the Higher Education Act, which established the federal student aid program, is a classic voucher program. If an institution meets a set of requirements, and after 1972, it could be a for-profit as well as a nonprofit institution, could enroll students who would carry with them what is a Pell Grant if not a voucher? What is having a subsidized student loan if not a voucher? So we have that system now. And the question is it working well for students? And is it working well for this mix of institutions? The United States is unique in having a extraordinarily pluralistic system. Typically in most countries, there are either mostly public institutions and a few typically high-level private institutions, or sometimes the reverse. But nobody has a model like ours. And the issue is, how do we preserve the best part of what we've got now with this pluralistic system and essentially a voucher process, but at the same time improve access, improve outcomes, exactly what Jamie is talking about. I mean, how do we come up with a better system? So it's not, do we go from A to B? It's how do we take what we have and make it better? I mean, the notion of providing better access for lower income students, for populations historically denied full access, is absolutely essential. Easy to say. How do we accomplish it? And how do we accomplish it in a way that is going to have the best outcomes, first and foremost, for the students, for the learners?
All right, I'm going to change up, and here's the question. How are the specialized accreditors engaged in the competency-based education conversation?
Short answer is I don't know, since we're all looking blank. I don't know. It would be, I mean, in some ways, there are some programs where the measure of the skills and knowledge seem to lend themselves beautifully to competency-based, because there are, you know, maybe it's just, somebody else's job always looks easier, but somehow some parts of some specialty fields, it seems to me, might be easier to measure because they're, and the existence of licensure exams show that. We have a common notion of what you need to know to be a physical therapist or a nurse, respecting completely that there are many soft and judgmental capacities there. But So it would be wonderful if they are or could be leaders, but I haven't heard that conveyed. And whether the self-pacing advantage of competency-based, which is one of the reasons that people find it so attractive, that people can move at different speeds, works well in, for example, clinical or various specialty areas, or whether that advantage is harder to do within some of the ways that they're structured. Anybody else know more about that answer?
Yeah, there's one example which is worth looking at. It's been around for ages. We don't think about it, and that's training pilots, which is absolutely competency-based. You go through first a set of written exams, and you study for those, and in various ways get the information, and then you are segmentally evaluated as to whether you know those written skills. I mean, do you know how to navigate? Do you know the parts of the engine? You know, all those things. And then you go into flight training. And you are demonstrating to a flight instructor that you know how to start the engine. You know how to taxi. You know how to take off. You know how to fly straight and level, make a turn, land, and not kill both of you, which is considered to be, by the way, a negative outcome. And at the end of that, you have an evaluation flight. And again, you've passed all the writtens, and your instructor says you have gone through each one of these learning modules. And then you have a flight exam with an FAA examiner. And she or he reviews that you can actually do these things well. So it's backstopping what the instructors say you've done. At the end of that, you get something called a pilot's license, and that is a competency certificate. You can fly an airplane of a certain type competently. I mean, it is the extraordinary model, and it's a difficult one to match because it is made up of such discrete elements. But we've had that, and we've had that, you know, since the 1920s. And yet we think about, you know, competency-based learning as a new invention. We need to apply it more broadly. We need to learn from what's been done over the past 100 years, and use it more effectively. But it's there. There's nothing new about competency-based learning. What is new is expanding it beyond a relatively narrow range of fields where there is comfort on the other side, employers and such, that a certificate based upon competencies is as valid as something based upon whether you manage to stay awake, you know, strike that, whether you manage to attend a sufficient number of classes.
Could I speak to that a bit? This is Francine, or more add a question, or like, I hear very clearly what you're saying, Mike, with respect to training, which is what you do for a pilot. And there are many courses of study in which it's training that equates to or culminates in a certificate or certification. But I always have problems with that when dealing with the broad spectrum of, the broad spectrum of higher education and what America has been great for, but even narrowing it down to the field of HBCUs and TCUs, and thinking about the notion of innovation, the whole realm of STEM, patents, new ideas, the whole thing that really fuels America. And I don't think that is training and certification. So how do we develop a system that strikes a balance and does that? The years of first-rate contributors to America from HBCUs and TCUs has not necessarily been, well, I'll put it differently. It has been with those who, with the education that has been provided them, have made significant and great contributions outside of the field of study in which they were in. So how do we corral this notion of competency-based or measuring academic success and keep this ball rolling, and particularly as we move into what is likely to become the major way we function, and that is through distance education and distance learning and treating those minority populations.
Yeah, let me, Francine, I want to respond directly because you make an interesting point. You're very brief. You use the term training for pilots. A pilot learns how to, a student pilot learns how to be a competent pilot and then demonstrates that competency. It's learning. A writer or a student writer or a student philosopher or a student engineer is learning how to be a competent writer, engineer, philosopher. The problem is not, one aspect is training and one aspect is education, the words that we use to separate these. It is vastly more difficult to measure competencies in a field like, for example, writing or philosophy than it is flying an airplane. But the fact that it's more difficult doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it. And I think the HBCUs and the TCIs have an opportunity here because of relatively smaller size, relatively more compact populations, to be a leader in finding ways to provide, to measure what someone is learning and to package those measurements into something that at the end of the day, the institution can say, you have demonstrated the competencies that we would expect in a writer, that we would expect in an electrical engineer, that we would expect in a philosopher. That's a huge challenge, and it's a monumental challenge for the accreditors in deciding whether or not that makes any sense. But I don't think it's fundamentally different.
To be continued.
And with that, and we're mindful of your time, we're going to just take a couple of more because I know some of you have been just waiting. Here's the question. Is guidance available that provides a framework for competency-based assessment and alignment with college credit?
Oh, I guess that one's mine.
Yes, Chris.
I am not positive, but I believe so. And what I'll do is give you my email address, and you can email me, and I'd be happy to email you back what we have. So it's Christopher.McCarran, MCCAGHREN @ed.gov. And we'd be happy to give you the information we have.
There are a lot of organizations out there that have done some really good work in this. USDLA is obviously one. The Online Learning Consortium is another. The accrediting agencies have put together guidance. Jamie can talk to more specifically in terms of best practice. I think an issue may be there's more information out there than is easy to access. I think it would be a service, and Reggie, maybe this is something USDLA can do, is put together a compendium of what's available and make that readily available. And I think making that available specifically to this audience, because again, we're not reinventing the wheel. I mean, I think we've all concluded round is kind of a good way to go. It's knowing how to use it, and there's a lot of groups have done really good work, and I think we should be part of the process to make that information available.
Good point. Note taken.
All right, and I'm going to just throw one more out, and then all of the questions will be addressed and posted on the website. But here's one I think the panelists should address. What are your thoughts on providing more accessibility to distance learning and evaluation tools on mobile? Do you think that new accreditation standards should be considered for virtual learning? And then there's more, but just in general, working on a paper, would love to okay, yes, your comments about accessibility and mobile.
I want to echo what Jamie said earlier about accreditation standards being applicable across multiple modalities. Although we've seen many issues that have come about with students rushing to remote instruction and not having faculty members that are appropriately trained to be able to deal with distance education students with broadband and equipment issues, the standards apply across the board. And I'll pitch it over to Jamie to add more on that one.
We don't get involved in a matter like whether the system that you use should be available to students on mobile, although that in many cases is a very natural way for students to operate and addresses some of the broadband access issues. But we are happy to help institutions think about questions in the accreditation process, like where are your programs succeeding? Where are they falling short? Where are students frustrated? What options might you have for the kind of improvement to achieve what you want to achieve? And sharing best practices around among institutions. We try to be agnostic as to the choices of how you will organize your programs or deliver them technologically, but as helpful as we possibly can be to help you understand where you're being successful or where you can learn from others.
Yeah, and Francine, could you respond a bit in terms of what your organization is doing in terms of particularly last mile and bandwidth issues?
Good question. What is my organization doing? We're working with federal partners to help make that achievable and to take place. That is part of the goal of the Minority Broadband Initiative, and that is to work with federal agencies and state and local governments to work with specifically historically Black colleges and universities and tribal colleges and universities to help make that happen, to bridge the gap, serve as a facilitator, if you will, to bridge the gap between state broadband networks, the quilt regional educational networks, and to facilitate at the state level, at the very least, connections between the institutions and those service providers and other entities that would help bridge that gap. I thank you for putting me on the spot on that one. But could I turn it around quickly, the very end, and that is, how will HBCUs and TCUs be affected by accreditation if they don't meet the very first condition, and that is having the proper broadband platforms for the delivery of distance education, if they have not been able or don't live in a place where there is broadband availability or access or link to the middle mile link that you're referring to, and if in fact a high percentage of the students who are to be engaged in distance learning programs live in areas of the United States where there is no availability or access to broadband. If those conditions aren't met, then schools can't necessarily implement full distance learning programs to address the educational needs across the board for all the programs that they have in effect. So how does that, is that going to play into the accreditation process? Now, forgive me about my ignorance about accreditation. This has all been a learning process for me as well. But it just seems a difficult issue.
Well,
it is let me just, knowing that time is short, let me just try a very quick distinction. I think accreditors and I speak for one, but I think this is true. We look at, in the case of an existing institution that wants to add distance learning opportunities, we would look at the program's design and structure and whether the academic program and the services that would be available to students would meet the accreditation requirements. We would not ask at that stage whether the wire or the signal to reach the students, we wouldn't ask the technology question. We would probably ask the questions about whether the enrollment projections were realistic. You've got a wonderful program you have just designed, but in your part of the very spread out area of New Mexico that you operate in, are your enrollment projections realistic for whether students will be able to get that program? Might be part of the conversation, but we wouldn't try to solve the technology problem or require particular technology specifications. We would be looking at the educational content of the program that the institution wanted to offer, or in the case of an institutional accreditor, the broad picture of whether that program fit the mission of the institution and whether the institution had a realistic plan for delivery, which does reflect that sort of technology question. But I think we would work sort of behind the scenes. We don't set a standard for accreditation of what technology is available to students, but if it hampered students' ability to get access to the program or to do well in it, it would be part of the reality of the delivery of the program. But it's a very nuanced question. And in part, it's a new one because I think institutions have not had to try to address the technology matter in a rush. Places that couldn't reach people technologically would say, I guess they'll have to come here, or we'll have to go to a location that we can reach those students. And so we have merged or mashed together the technology reality and the traditional way of understanding, of asking a different set of questions. Does this program as designed have the learning and student support services and library access? And yes, now all of a sudden we realize that student services and library access are contingent on whether you can keep a signal going for an hour at a time. Or get one at all.
That's the result.
Or afford it. Or here when your
issue.
children are learning. Right, the pandemic sort of collapsing those issues together.
So with that, everyone, Dr. Smith, as we conclude, there's one question, almost a challenge to you, USDLA, and the panelists. Are there models out there that address the quality of education delivered by distance education as opposed to traditional face-to-face models without making any assumption that the traditional approach has served us well? That will be the challenge for you all to come back. Again, audience, we are over time. We thank you very much. All of your questions will be addressed, and there's more to come. On behalf of NTIA, the Department of Education, and USDLA. I thank you as the moderator for the chat, and we'll turn this back over to Dr. Smith and the panelists.
Well, thank you, and very timely. And I know we try to address that is a big challenge. We have a quality certification program. We look at that from USDLA, and there are other organizations that have programs. With that being said, we accept the challenge. These are challenging times. I want to thank all the panelists, definitely and we'll continue this discussion going forward. With that being said, thank everyone. I will pass it over to our host, Francine to kind of give some quick rounding conclusions and thoughts and kind of bring us to a close, at least for this session, but to continue the discussion going forward.
And I think that's the way to approach it, Dr. Smith, Reggie. I simply want to say thank you to each of you for taking part in this discussion and for being candid and for being open and for training me. It's been a learning session for me. We knew from our exchanges with faculty and leadership at HBCUs and TCUs that such a discussion was needed, but I did not know the scope and depth and reality of it, how far reaching it is. I am always amazed at the degree and scope of caring and depth of knowledge that people have to bring to bear. I shouldn't say amazed, but it's always good to see it come together in this collaborative fashion. So I really want to close by saying thank you to all of you and extending the invitation to all of you to maybe have a debrief discussion on this and to find a way to answer the questions that are outstanding and that we have not been able to address. Have a good evening to everyone. Thank you again for your participation. Thank you for your contributions. Thank you for your service. Okay. And with that, we'll call it a wrap.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
It's our pleasure. Okay, Chris?
Yes, Francine.
Would you close the session, please? But make sure
I
you
certainly will, and I'll
keep
give
all
you
of
a
our
call.
keep all of our questions.
I can do that
Thank
for you.
you.
I'll give you a call in a few minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Lori. Hi, Francine.